Wavesound Audiobooks presents The Last Correspondent by Michael Smith, narrated by the author. Dedication to my grandmother Margaret for sharing her love of storytelling. Prologue. On September 7th, 2020, I was evacuated from China by the Australian government after spending 4 days under consular protection. It was a dramatic and disappointing end to the Australian Financial Review's 16-year presence in Shanghai. For the first time since diplomatic ties were established in 1972, there were no journalists working for Australian media outlets on the ground in China. Understanding a country reshaping Australia's and the world's future more than any other power suddenly became a whole lot harder. Colleen Ryan and Stephen Wyatt set up the AFR's first bureau in Shanghai in 2004. The newspaper had previously been covering China from Hong Kong and briefly Beijing. But Shanghai was an attractive base, as most of the big Australian companies were there. They found a house and the staff and established those early connections which would become crucial for dozens of future correspondents. There had been earlier Australian trailblazers in China too. Geelong-born George Morrison was the world's first correspondent covering China out of Peking when he was hired by the Times newspaper in 1897. More than a century later in 2020, foreign correspondents and their staff faced unprecedented risks and harassment trying to report on President Xi Jinping's China. In May that year, 14 outstanding journalists working for American outlets, including an Australian citizen, the New York Times' Chris Buckley, were expelled or had their visas revoked. Another Australian, the Wall Street Journal's Philip Wen, was among 3 foreign journalists ordered to leave in February. In August, Australian-Chinese journalist Cheng Lei was detained in Beijing. 6 months later, in February 2021, she was formally arrested on suspicion of illegally supplying state secrets. Other Australian journalists trying to get into China that year were struggling to get visas approved. A short time after Cheng's detention, the Australian Broadcasting Corp's Bill Birtles and I left after becoming targets in a tit-for-tat political game as hostilities between Beijing and Canberra plunged to new lows. In the end, the biggest challenge in covering China was the fear the country's 1.4 billion people have of their own government. In my last year there, sources became increasingly reluctant to speak to a foreign journalist.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?